Hi, it's Plastic EP here again with Steve Marinucci, and let's talk Beatles Part 2. How are you again, Steve?
I'm doing fine, Plastic EP. How are you?
Good, you're looking good out there in the sun, getting a bit of a tan. Now, I've got to ask you how you got involved in the Beatle business, how you started off, what you did, and you became a Beatles expert. Let's hear it.
Well, like everybody else, I saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show, um, and I kind of, I have to admit that just before that time, I didn't know who they were, and a friend of mine had mentioned them to me and said, you know, had, had mentioned the Beatles because they had divided my class up into two groups, and one of them, his group was called the Beatles, and I said, why did you call them the Beatles? And he said, you never heard of the Beatles? And I said, no. And he explained who they were. And then when I saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show, you know, that did it. And we went out and got records, my sister and I. And I didn't get to see them, unfortunately. I was living on the East Coast at the time. But, I followed their music, through the years. When I was working for for my newspaper, I used to have access to wire stories about them and information before anybody else did. And so at one point I said, I was interested in the internet, and I said, well, why don't I try and do a website? And it was at that point that I built what became Abbey Road page, which everybody remembers. I built it from scratch. I did the whole thing. The news thing didn't start right away. It I don't remember how long it was before I started doing that.
Steve, what year was
But
that you started the website? What year?
I'm thinking it was '86.
Okay.
I'm thinking it was '86. Anyway, so I did it, and I um, I started doing the news, and it developed from there. I started. I was spending like 3 hours a night after working full time during the day in doing that, and it really came to a head when George Harrison got ill, because I followed everything that happened with him. There was nobody else doing that at the time. There was nobody else, now you have people, you know, posting wire stories, stealing newspaper copy and putting that up. But I was writing, because I was a journalist. I worked at a newspaper. So um, I did that. And then the night George passed away, a friend of mine woke me up at like 3 o'clock in the morning. He called me and he said, "Did you know George had passed?" I said, "No." And I immediately got on the computer and I started writing, and I didn't go back to bed that night. And so that was really, that was one thing I will never forget. But the other thing was a year later, I got a hint, or I got a tip from somebody that something was about to happen at Royal Albert Hall. Jules Holland had been playing there, but one night was left open, and he wondered if maybe something was going to happen, or whoever it was. I don't remember who the person was. Whoever it was, thank you. But anyway, it turned out that it was going to be the concert for George, and I was the first one to reveal that. And it came like 3 or 4 days before the official announcement. And so, about the only thing that was wrong in the tips that I got was that Dylan was going to be there, because they kept telling me Dylan. We heard it beforehand that Dylan was going to be there, and obviously he was not. So anyway, so that was very interesting. I mean, among other things, I have seen Paul now. I'm trying to think of how many times I've seen him. Several times. I've seen Ringo several times. When Paul got the star on the Walk of Fame, I covered it with the press, and I was standing there with my little camera, and Paul stood right in front of me, like, I could reach out my hand, and there he was. And I was nervous as hell. And what had happened was somebody had brought a Hofner bass replica and wanted him to sign it, and the guy who had it was right directly in back of where I was standing. They handed the guitar past me. I think I actually may have given it to Paul. I don't remember. Paul signed it. We gave it back to the guy, and yeah, so that was kind of cool. And then when Ringo had his star on the Wall of Fame, I went to the reception beforehand, and I talked to Ringo for about a minute. Didn't get to talk to him very long. I basically introduced myself, and I'll tell you, that was the scariest time of my life, because I'm looking at him, right face to face, somebody I had idolized, and there he was. So,
same thing happened to me when I met Peter Tork and Mickey Dolenz and David Jones. I mean, there's my heroes, pop culture heroes from the 60s, and I'm just standing there, and there's a photo taken of me staring at Mickey's face, because I'm replaying in my head all the scenes that he did in the Monkees growing up when I was young, and it was just like 100 miles an hour running through my head, and I've got this photo where I'm just staring at his face like he's the real deal. And that's the same with the Beatles. They're the real deal in person.
Right. I never did meet Davey, although I interviewed all four Monkees, but I've never met Davey. But I have met personally Peter, Mickey, and Mike. And that is an exceptional experience, especially meeting Mike, who I told him, I said, I have to tell you, I mean, you are, somebody I have idolized from day one. And he was very, he was very humble. He was a really nice guy. And I mean, I interviewed him. I was lucky enough to interview all four Monkees, but Mike's was the longest. The first time I interviewed him, it was over an hour. He was incredible. He was very, he's great to talk to. I mean, he's very philosophical, as you all know from his books. But
and after talking to him for an hour, Steve, just tell me a little bit about that interview, if you can, with Mike. That sounds fascinating.
Well, we started. I'm trying to remember when the interview was. It was about a year or so ago, and actually, I have to tell you. I told you earlier about upcoming shows. I just interviewed Mickey and Mike again, and actually, there's going to be an article coming out in Billboard this week about that. And again, I talked to Mike for over an hour. I talked to Mickey for about a half hour. So you're getting a scoop. There's a world.
Hey, Plastic EP got the scoop, but I got to tell you, Steve, where I'm at, I'm one of the biggest Monkees fans in Australia, and I'll tell you why. When the Beatles came here in 1964, I'm 6 years old. I don't know what's going on. And then I become 8 years old to 9, and the Monkees have just hit because in 1966, they started in the US, but the Monkees didn't hit Australia till 1967 because we're 6 months behind the US. So that's why my generation. That's my group. I'm proud of that. You know what I mean? And even telling me now this scoop, it's made the interview.
And you know, one of the things that if you get into a discussion with them that is interesting is the fact that they consider themselves more actors than musicians, and I really disagree with that. And I think I told Mike that the other day, that I said, you know, with all you guys did, or I told Mickey, I can't remember which one, but with all they did with the albums, like for example, Headquarters, which is a tremendous album. Um, there's no way that you can't say that they were not musicians, and it bothers me a lot. For example, that Rolling Stone, you know, has kept them out of the Hall of Fame because they really don't deserve it. I mean, there's a lot of other musicians, a lot of other groups that, you know, that use studio musicians and were, you know, we're not as creative as the Monkees were. So creative is not the word I was looking at, but that's, I guess that's kind of a good way to put it. So
I just got to say with the Monkees, if I can, Steve, just my take on it, right? I mean, they're based on the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night. That's the idea. Let's do a Beatles Hard Day's Night TV show for America, right? These guys are going to be, let's try the American Beatles. But what happens is those guys were so talented that they went from being in a TV show to going live on the stage and doing everything and much more than you would expect from anybody. They were musicians, they were actors. But I'll tell you what, their talent and what they did is unbelievable because the Monkees are the first group where you had not only the motion picture industry behind them, but you also had the recording industry behind them. So you had this massive corporate machine that they've never seen before that was unified. That's what happened in 1966. It's like, bang, we're the Monkees, but everyone's behind us. Best songwriters, best producers for TV, best record people, and that's why the Monkees are legitimate more than anyone thinks.
well, you know, I was thinking about this the other day, and I didn't get a chance to mention it to either of them. But if you think about it, Magical Mystery Tour and Head were both kind of um, sticking it to the establishment. Magical Mystery Tour was the Beatles doing their own thing on their own, and so was Head, except Head was more rebellious, I guess is the term you could probably use in terms of what it was and what it turned out to be. And if you compare the two projects, I think Head is by far not only the better movie, but it's also a better statement in terms of creative statement. And I think something that rarely get, I don't know that anybody's ever compared the two before, but I really believe that if you do compare the two, that Head really comes out on top. You know, I know the Beatles um, remastered Magical Mystery Tour a few years ago in hopes of again rewriting history and making people think better of it, but I didn't think that worked. In fact, I got into some couple of big arguments about it online on another podcast that I used to be on. But I do better projects much better.
Steve,
So
I gotta
yes.
thank you so much because I know you're pressed for time. But I'll tell you what, talking about the Beatles and talking about the Monkees, you made my day today because now we can put this out to all the Beatles groups and all the Monkees groups. So from Plastic EP, it's been my pleasure, and I hope we talk again, Steve, because I've really thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure there's so many topics that we can cover.
Okay, Plastic EP, thank you very much for the opportunity to be on. And again, hello to everyone in Australia and everyone watching all over the world. It's been a pleasure to do this with you.
Thank you, Steve. We'll talk to you again.
And one of these days, maybe you can come on my podcast and we can talk.
I'd love to. I'd love to do that, Steve. Seriously. All right. From
Okay.
Australia and from the US, take it out, Steve. Bye.
Thank you, Classic EP. Goodbye,
Thank
everyone.
you.